like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like this, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right. In this episode, we mentioned a statistic about sex-specific birth ratios in relation to the DRC. That was something that she had discovered just a few minutes before we recorded. And so afterwards, she sent me a message to say the trend was accurate. That was describing something real, but it was overstated. So she was able to do more math, go back over it. And just in the interest of fairness, we wanted to let y'all know that the extent of that was overstated, although it is an actual trend. But anyway, on with the show. All right, Aydin Paladin, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you back on. Our last episode was fascinating, a ton of fun. But as I'm no doubt convinced you're aware, time goes fast on the internet, and
Yes.
I put a kind of like a mental note, like, oh, I should have Aydin back on. And then I checked the feed, and I was like, oh wow, that was a really long time ago. So glad to have you back on.
Yeah, thanks.
I was catching up on one of your videos. It was pretty fascinating, talking about effectively the effects of the internet. And while I want to talk about that, just off script, right? We were talking behind the scenes. You found out something, or you discovered something earlier today that was genuinely disturbing. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. I might as well. I made a thread on Twitter about it a couple of days ago while I was earlier in this research process. And I DM'd Ed Dutton about it to ask if he was familiar with this. And he was familiar with the general hypothesis behind it, but I think not so much this application. So what I accidentally stumbled across, and the whole story is actually quite funny as to how I did, is maybe one of the most disturbing things, but I think also very useful things that people on our side, such as it were, may find of interest and very deep concern. And that is sex ratios at birth. Sex ratios at birth seems like something that wouldn't be necessarily that interesting. We know that there's around parity between the sexes. There's, about an equal number of men and women. Or we would assume that's the case at birth, I think. That's not the case. There's more males, generally speaking, who are born than women. And there's a number of reasons for that. More men die in utero, males die in utero. More males die as a result of stillbirth, a significant percentage. Of course, also males, as they reach adolescence in particular, become very risk prone, will make risky decisions that can cause them to get themselves killed. They're also more likely to die in war. They're more likely to die as a result of occupational hazards. Men die younger. So the actual sex ratios of populations are always skewed a little bit, not always, but often skewed a bit female, to just compensate for male death. So more males are born. The Trivers-Willard hypothesis was this hypothesis that a sociologist and a computer scientist came up with in the 70s, I believe. And it was essentially that when times are good and there are excess resources in a society, it's not as disadvantageous or as much of a high cost to the mother to gestate and give birth to a son who is less genetically fit, because there is much more variation in whether or not a son will be able to reproduce than a daughter. Most women who can reproduce do. Most sons who can reproduce, or not all sons who reproduce do, who can. You'll have some males that will reproduce a lot, and you'll have some males that will reproduce some, and you will have a portion of males that will not reproduce at all. So when times are tough, expending the resources that it takes to gestate and then care for that son, who himself will not be able to subsequently reproduce, is a biological calculated waste. And as such, when the woman's body determines that I do not have the resources to dedicate to gestating and giving birth to a son who will not be reproductively successful, the fetus is terminated. This usually happens very quickly in the pregnancy in the first couple of stages. It's just a biologically made calculation. It's better to make sure that your genes are propagated to have a daughter. because she's far more likely to reproduce regardless of her genetic fitness. So what we find is, via this sex ratio at birth and Trivers-Willard hypothesis, confirmation of the adage that good times create weak men, because more men in general will be born. They would otherwise be cold in utero, essentially. When times are tough, there are fewer but fitter males born. What I then finished today in this calculation was going through, I was collecting census data, because the really interesting thing about this metric, sex ratios at birth, is that you can track it both longitudinally as a thermometer for the health of a society, and you can also track it immediately after extreme events, some sorts of tragedies. After the Great Depression, for example, COVID reduced sex ratios at birth, 9/11 reduced sex ratios at birth, because there is a perception in the population that times are tough. So more males are lost in utero. You can then see this on countrywide bases. So for example, African nations have a sex ratio at birth of about 101, 102, 100. Some of them, I think Namibia is one, where it skews under 100. There are more females more than males. That's how tough times are in these African nations. In the West, and globally speaking, the average is about 105 to 106, 104, in that range. If you look, the one I finished the calculations on this morning, and why I'm a little scatterbrained, was for England. So I went in and calculated the sex ratios at birth for immigrants to England. It's higher than normal. So for example, the sex ratio at birth for Indian immigrants in England is about 1.15, 115 males for every 100 females. For the Chinese immigrants to Australia, it's also quite high. It's like 1.14, 114 sons to Chinese immigrants to 100 daughters. For England, which I went ahead and calculated then, the adjusted weighted sex ratios at birth for white British people is not 1.05, as is the global average, 105 sons per 100 daughters. It's 1.015, 101 sons for 100 daughters. That is the same sex ratio at birth for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If higher sex ratios at birth mean better times, because more males are allowed to be produced, then the physical conditions, in a way unmeasurable and untouchable by things like GDP number go up, good, indicates that the real conditions on the ground for white Brits is the same as people living in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
So just one thing here. Obviously, that number is shocking, right?
Yeah.
But playing devil's advocate and saying this is someone who's relatively innumerate, so bear with me on this.
Mhm.
So when we're talking about hard times, or is that a relative or an absolute measure, right?
It
So
doesn't
for instance,
matter.
Okay.
Because it's biological. It's the body perceiving times as hard. So
Okay.
again, no other factors other than what the body is reacting to in its environment is being processed here. Something about the environment in the UK is causing white British women to have a sex ratio at birth that is analogous to the Congo. So whatever poor condition, and it's poor conditions or uncertainty. We know this is, again, 9/11 happens, the sex ratio at birth plummets in New York. COVID happens, sex ratios at birth plummet worldwide. To a small degree, because I don't think people took COVID that seriously, if I'm being honest. Most people didn't, so it didn't have those vast effects. But in 9/11 in New York, absolutely. And again, if you look throughout history, you can see Great Depression, sex ratio at birth drops. Any period of economic stress, sex ratio at birth drops. During wars, sex ratio at birth drops.
Got it. Okay, that makes more sense. Effectively, so it is that perception of instability. Because obviously, if it were simple, like direct physical risk, I mean, obviously 9/11 was a tragedy, but by the raw numbers, it is significantly more dangerous to live through, normal life in the Democratic Republic of the Congo
Yes.
than in New York. And this is not an endorsement of New York, right? It's damning by faint praise, if anything. But
yeah, I think it's hard to because that's obviously true.
Yeah,
but
of
it's
course.
the perceived, the relative conditions, right? So why do sex ratios at birth go up for immigrants? Well, their relative conditions from their homelands increases. And by the way, that doesn't stop at first generation. It tracks until third generation, when all 4 grandparents were born in the country, not of origin, but of immigration. That is when the elevated sex ratio at birth stops, is after 3 generations where all of one's grandparents were born in, say, Canada.
Well, and that seems like that would exacerbate a trend already, right? We're particularly in Europe. The vast majority, and I know it is over 90%, I cannot tell you the exact number, of migrants, in heavy scare quotes, to England, to other European nations as well, are male, right? So you have this kind of like super concentration of young men. Now, obviously, the majority of the immigrants newly arrived are, as we've heard a number of times, men of fighting age. But, on the off chance that they do, find a woman from their culture or from another, that child, again, is significantly more likely to be male, right? Exacerbating that problem even worse.
And even further than that, they're more likely to be I'm trying to find a good way to phrase this. The literature calls it a fragile male, but let me put it another way. It's a male that is unlikely to reproduce. That's why they're terminated in utero when times are tough, and there's a biological consideration made that this son will not be able to reproduce because of genetic fitness factors, a fragile male. Those males are instead born. Males who are unable, this is based on data from Washington State at a point in time where the immigrant population, by the way, was about 7%. So keeping that as part of the calculation. But based on those data, a man who gets married or has a child is about 20% less likely to be arrested for any crime. So we're not only talking about importing vastly disproportionate number of males into the country, their children will be disproportionately male and disproportionately genetically unfit, fragile, and specifically for the reason that they would have been aborted because they would be unlikely to reproduce, are subsequently even further more likely to commit various types of crime. Just based on pure statistical data.
Yeah, geez, that's not exactly uplifting.
No.
Right? Well, and this was something I was speaking to Dr. Dutton about a few weeks ago, which is that obviously within any group you have sort of a standard distribution of certain traits, right? Not that's correct. You have a distribution, not a standard distribution. Men tend to, in almost every aspect, have a flatter distribution curve than women comparatively, right?
Yes.
So more extremes on both ends. And so again, right, that is just a male trait. You add into this, right, which is effectively a further flattening of that curve, right? There is a greater proportion of men, specifically outlier males, right? The ones that might not be fit. And remember, of course, right, this is all throughout Dutton's work, that many of these negative traits tend to be correlated, right? You don't tend to only have one or two, shall we say, and we have to be delicate with the wording here, but unfortunate genetic outcomes, shall we say. And so when you look at the extreme level of violence, right? This kind of like almost unreasoning level of violence. It's like, well, you have multiple things at once, right? You have, a certain population with certain trends viewed in aggregate. You have, okay, well, who are the people most likely to effectively decide to get on a boat and journey halfway across the world? Okay, you're selecting for a certain population.
Yeah.
Then when they get there, it's like a further and further refining for negative social traits. And then you add this, this trend in birth rate. And it's like, it's a very, very scary trend line that you're tracking.
I mean, I would say that the interesting thing about it, I mean, it's horrifying, but I guess like the spin on it, if you wanted to try and give it one, is that for people who want to immigrate to other countries to give their children a better life, understand that the children that you will have in that country will be dysgenic, will be less likely to reproduce themselves, and will be more likely to be criminals. Just by pure statistical, it again has no value judges. I'm taking culture out of it. I'm taking cultural norms out of it. We're stripping this down to as value free as it can possibly be. Pure genetics, pure biology. Just by those statistics, you are more likely to have a son. He is less likely to reproduce and more likely to be a criminal if you move from Pakistan to England.
Well, and obviously the other side of that equation as well is, what are the stressors affecting British mothers? You're in the UK, correct?
Yeah, I'm in the Channel Islands, which UK protectorate. Yeah.
All right, well, we'll go with it. The old line about from Mark Twain of God invented war to teach Americans geography is quite accurate. And since we have not discovered large oil deposits in the Channel Islands, I don't know where that is.
It's in the English Channel, so yeah. There you go.
I probably could have figured that one out. But I do talk to a lot of Brits, obviously, selecting, shall we say, a certain population. But it seems as if things in England are going very badly. Obviously, immigration has been a huge issue for, let's be honest, 15 years plus or minus, almost entirely unaddressed. You have a cost of living crisis. You have a wage crisis. And yeah, sure, it's not, although it's fast becoming, right, a sub-Saharan African nation. That obviously produces an incredible stressor. And I'm curious, do you see and I don't know the answer to this, but do you see a later age of first birth for British mothers? Because it stands to reason if sort of insecurity is a sort of, if insecurity prevents people from becoming mothers, or increases the rate of female children as a sort of safeguard, it would stand to reason that births are also pushing later, and by extension, again, not a math guy, so bear with me on this, that would also probably tend to lower lifetime number of births, and also, I assume, more dysgenic traits. Am I completely talking out of my ass there?
No, actually, and that's a whole nother area of this research, is that there are historical examples of countries that have had skewed sex ratios. For example, Australia being a prime example, where you had numbers of men that vastly outnumbered women. This changes the behaviors of women. Women who live in areas of Australia today that in the past had one standard deviation, fewer women in the past, so that women were even more scarce. Work, I think, if I recall correctly, it's something like 2 to 3 hours less a week, and they devote less time to child rearing, because what was valued in women at that time was leisure, was not because they were so rare, they were prized, they didn't have to do anything. So when you find skewed sex ratios that lean towards male during good times, right, women become less active. They're prizes to be sought after. Of course, we have data, a lot of data from the opposite way, of when there's far more women in the society because the men have been killed. And in that case, you find increases, I was looking at the Rwandan genocide. I've looked, of course, at the First and Second World Wars, coinciding almost directly, but in a staggered nature with that. After the death of males, more women enter the workforce, and subsequently positive attitudes towards gender equality and a woman's amount of say in household duties, etc., increases. So too does age at first birth of a child. And so decreases also fertility. So following periods where men have died, say in the First and Second World Wars, in the subsequent generations, the females of that society will have lowered fertility.
Yeah, sort of an interesting example when you look at the Soviet Union, right? They lost, depending on who you ask, 10 to 20 million men. Obviously, many women as well during the Second World War. And I think that the social consequences of that there's obviously a couple to look at. I think perhaps the most interesting is the inspiration for Clockwork Orange, right? The sort of Soviet youth gangs, where there were these, groups of children, many of whom had no father, mother working, that kind of descended into like Lord of the Flies lawlessness.
Yeah.
But obviously, as you said as well, you have consequently, increased female participation in the workforce. And look, like I know the Russian government is trying to reverse course on their birth rate, but I mean, the Russian birth rate effectively cratered. And it makes sense, right? Obviously, you have a massive die off of men, right, at the hands of the Germans, let alone what, Stalin was doing himself. And yeah, it doesn't make sense that would create that sort of knock-on effect. I'm also curious, what are the effects of being, assuming we have all these trends pushing the birth rate down, right? That would consequently, show that there are smaller families. So what are the effects of being an only child, right? Because it seems like that would also be, significant.
I'm really not familiar. I mean, I'm sure that there are numerous effects. I'm an only child. But this actually doesn't have anything to do, well, it does a little bit, but as a second order sort of effect about birth rate. It's about birth sex ratios. So this is, again, totally even removed from birth rate. The fact that migrants have more children on average, or may have more children on average than the local population. It doesn't seem to, in fact, it only gets worse. The more children, the more girls in particular, that an immigrant family to the US, UK, Canada, Australia has, the greater the likelihood of having a boy. This increases in a really horrifying way if they've had two girls and ever had an abortion. If they've had two girls and an abortion, immigrants from India to Australia, their likelihood of having a boy approaches 4 males to every 1 female. So, and that's has nothing to do with then the numbers of children. So then let's say they have 10 children. Well, then it's all males. It's going to be male after male after male, just statistically speaking. So they have more children, they have more male children, and those male children are more likely to be genetically unfit.
That's a really fascinating it's a really fascinating piece of data you brought out there. I will admit, Aydin, I am at the limits of both my knowledge of this subject and my ability to discuss statistics.
Sorry.
No, not at all. Obviously, I'm excited to see what you produce with that finding. But I want to talk with you about your video about the internet. Obviously, it sort of starts off viewing things through the prism of some recent kind of RedTube drama with Ethan Klein and the artist formerly known as iDubbbz and others kind of chimping out at each other. Which, by the way, I was never a huge fan of either one of those people, but it's almost sad at a certain point. Like the line from Lewis, right? Like, hell is God giving you exactly what you want, right? You watch that and you're like, geez, I wouldn't trade it for anything.
It's certainly entertaining, yes.
Oh, 100%. So I'm curious, right? You mentioned a couple studies of to kind of support your arguments, many of which mentioned the effects of, should we say, like high arousal and low arousal media. Obviously, when we say arousal, term of art, don't get too excited. But I'm curious, do you want to sort of explain your findings there?
I'm trying to remember what specifically, because that was a couple months ago that I really dug into that on the effects of the internet stuff. Because that's been a few months. I've worked on like some massive things in between, and now this stuff is this sex ratio at birth thing is overwhelming my brain, so I'd have to reorient myself.
So effectively, if I remember, what the experiment did was they took a number of German college students and gave them some reading comprehension and memorization, right? Where effectively they've said, hey, read this article, memorize some words in Turkish, which none of them spoke, and then they showed them different media. Do you remember where we're going with this, Aydin?
Yeah, so it's this mere exposure effect thing of the internet, which is related. I don't, that study went into it, but this was the general finding that I was pulling out there, which is that mere exposure to the internet, there's this kind of colloquial idiom or belief that the internet is making people dumber. And it's a little bit difficult to find direct evidence for that internet use equals decreasing IQ score, for example. We wouldn't actually expect to find that, but or decreased scores on tests, but you do find the decreased academic performance stuff. You do find decreased scores on tests, but you don't find differences in IQ so much, at least like over the lifetime, because IQ is more stable. So what's happening here was the question. And what it appears to be is that when there is access to the internet, people know what they don't know what they're necessarily looking for. They don't know what the truth is. They don't know what the information is. They know how to find it. So they have replaced their capacity to store information long term with information on how to access the information rather than accessing it directly that's stored in their brains. They're externalizing and outsourcing processing power to the computer.
All right, so as you guys are no doubt aware, we've changed our business model at the Jay Burden Show. New big development is Jay Burden Show premium feed. You still get the same content no matter when or where you watch, but if you want the episodes early and ad-free, you'll have to throw me a few bucks on Patreon, Subscribestar, Substack, or Gumroad. Links down in the description for those. Again, your financial support is not required. You still get the same stuff on the regular free feed, but I really appreciate it if you'd consider throwing me a few dollars. It's how I keep the lights on here. Thank you, and let's get on with the show.
So one study, for example, was if they had if a phone, they were taking a test in a class, and they had their phone in their pocket, or they had their phone sitting on the teacher's desk at the front of the classroom, or they were told to leave their phones outside. These all affected how people performed on the test. People who could physically see the phone performed the worst on the test because they could see the source of the information was sitting there right outside of their touch. They performed worse than people who had it in their pockets or in their backpack. And the people who performed best on the test were people who left their phones outside.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting thing. Speaking purely anecdotally, right? My wife is a teacher. I know a lot of teachers, and she's taught at both public and private institutions. And the difference in technology policy is stark. Now, obviously, you're selecting for different populations. One is a free service. The other one you have to pay for. Obviously, you're getting both wealthier students and students with more attentive parents. But the technology aspect is really interesting because at one school, right, you not only have access to your phone during the school day, right? Can't necessarily pull it out in class, but between classes, you can, go and scroll skibbity toilet videos or whatever the children do nowadays. But also, the actual learning itself is done via computer. You have a smart board, but you also have your Chromebook. And so you do a lot of work on that computer. Whereas the other institution, nobody is allowed to have their phone at all. It is entirely analog. And she switched from one to the other very recently. And one of the things she was talking about is a huge shift in attention span, right? The ability of children to follow a through line. Another person I know at that same institution, long-term friend of mine, she spoke about this in kind of a more general sense. She's taught for a very long time at both, American schools, international, online, very experienced teacher. And again, this is an anecdote, but she is not the sort of typical complaining teacher, right? Everything's going to hell. I hate it. But she said there was a very definite shift teaching sort of pre and post digital natives, basically children who grew up exclusively with access to a smartphone versus those who may have had a phone but got it later in life. And since she was primarily a literature teacher, she said that it made her job very difficult because it was specifically the ability to, on like an essay or something like that, trace a single line of thought over distance, right? So not simply to respond to a question, but to, bring multiple things together. And her hypothesis, at the very least, was that that process of trading out knowledge for how to find knowledge, and with it a certain kind of, I guess, loss of your ability to hold multiple pieces of information at once in your brain and synthesize them together, had made that very difficult. I realize that is two anecdotes. It is not exactly a peer-reviewed study, but I thought it was something interesting to bring up and kind of support that.
Well, it totally aligns. I mean, the anecdote, as they often do, aligns with the data on that, which is that, it's essentially what's happening is your brain doesn't have to know the information anymore. It only has to know where to find it. People use all kinds of analogies to describe the way the brain works, and actually describing it like a computer works okay, in that you just have a file or a folder for information, and instead of opening a document within that folder, it redirects you to a Google search. But you have no internet access. So you're left with a 404. So there's no information there. Just the only information that's stored in these folders in the brain is not the actual information, but a hyperlink. And if there's no internet, then the hyperlink is worthless.
Yeah, you see this as well with the transition from oral to written cultures. And there are a number of sources on this. I can't cite them at the moment, which is sort of ironic, I guess, given our subject matter, where they describe talking to pre-literate people who have incredible memories, right? So you see this even in like the Western oral tradition.
Yes.
So you look at something like Homer, right? Homer was eventually written down, but originally it was memorized and spoken, right? This massive tome. And obviously people could read, the written language existed, but it was much more specific, right? It was not universal. And you see, right, even a small part, right, that sort of that offloading that memory, right, to, the written page. You no longer have to memorize, all 200 some pages of the Iliad or whatever. And obviously, the human brain has the capacity to do that. There are still people who have incredible memories. They tend to be a little bit on the spectrum, but whatever. It is a possibility of like the human biological animal, if you will. But it is an interesting way, and you see this in McLuhan, you see this in Kaczynski and others, where even if technology doesn't change the biological human necessarily, right? It doesn't make you into a new creature. It does sort of set the parameters for your brain and for your thinking. And it seems as if the internet is doing that as well.
Well, it absolutely does, because the speech thing is interesting, because my immediate thought there, I don't have a source for this either, but this would be my hypothesis on this as well, is that typically speaking, if more parts of your brain get involved in some activity, more of it's equated to actual memory, long-term memory. So that's, for example, like Broca's aphasia is a condition where in the Broca's area of the brain, which affects spoken speech. So that you would be able to read something, you would be able to understand people, but when you would go to speak, it would come out as gibberish. You can see examples. You can go to YouTube and look up examples of Broca's aphasia, and it will be people speaking what sounds like gibberish, but to them, what they're saying is perfectly normal. They think that they're speaking fluent English or whatever language they're speaking. So there's a whole nother area of the brain that gets involved when you engage in the act of speaking something. In fact, me going through all of this SRB data, one of the things that I did while reading it was talk to my friends online and talk to my husband about it, because part of being able to then explain and talking here about it, because part of being able to explain it and recite it or whatever aids in the retention of that information versus even just writing it down. More parts of the brain working on it. And so you have less parts of the brain working on processing information when it involves the internet, because the internet, computers, algorithms, whatever, are doing all the thinking for you. So you just don't have to use those parts of your brain as much.
Well, this goes a little bit woo-woo, but I'll bring it back. You actually see this in sort of traditional Western education, and it does get into kind of, depending on who you ask, some weird like hermetic magic type stuff, but that is a certain take on it, right? There's obviously a scientific one as well. So, when you look at, the trivium or the quadrivium, right? The traditional way people were educated in a liberal education, right? There is this sort of process of building up, right? The first is the grammar, right? Literally how to construct a sentence, right? The simple facts. Then, you move up to the rhetoric, right? Which is obviously logic, is the intermediate stage, right? Where you were building the kind of simple syllogisms to, form an opinion. And then finally a synthesization, right? The actual rhetoric of it. How do you, convince someone else of your points based off of both an understanding of logic and the simple facts on the ground. But what's interesting is, the fourth stage of that in the quadrivium, right, is an actual performance of what you have done, right? Your ability to be an orator. And it's interesting because obviously in that you are building one stage upon the other, but you can't really say you've mastered it until you can, synthesize it, deliver it, and convince someone else of it, literally in like a person to person, or like a, sort of like on a stage, right? And obviously, like I said, there's some like weird woo-woo stuff that's, probably outside of the scope of this conversation. But what's particularly interesting to that is, one, there is an understanding that the different subjects they are not sort of canned, right? They're not separate one from another. And what's particularly interesting is that there are benefits from learning one subject that apply to other fields of knowledge that are not immediately apparent. Latin is a great example, right? Latin makes you both a better mathematician and a better English grammatician. Is that the form of the word we're going with? Let's go
It
with
gives you a deeper
right?
understanding of the English language and its functions.
Right, but it also teaches you to think in a
Yes.
mathematical way.
Yeah.
Right, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? Again, you see a sort of social technology, right? A way of learning, effectively rewriting your brain past the simple understanding of, basic fact. Sorry, that was a little bit of an off-topic digression,
no.
but as you can tell, I'm interested in this stuff.
Yeah, that's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, actually. So the Sapir-Whorf...
I have never heard of that. Could you explain it to me?
Sure. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that if a word for something doesn't exist in someone's language, it functionally doesn't exist at all. And so that our minds are constructed around the language that we have to describe things. And there are excellent outlier examples that evidence this in reality. There's a tribe of people in the Amazon rainforest called the Paraha people. They only have, and I'm not going to get this correct, but it's something like 3 vowel sounds and maybe 10 consonants. So they have a very, very limited ability for sounds that their language allows for. They have words for one, some, many, and nothing else. They don't have specific, so they have very limited ability to count things. They have no word for zero or lack of something. And as a result of these things, from the reports of missionaries who lived with them and for years and did these ethnographic research, is that, for example, when the missionaries would come in on the biplanes, in land in the river, the children would make, or they did make, at least in one case, this incredible replica of the plane. They were able to build it. And then when the missionaries left for a while, they came back, they found that the replica had been just discarded. And when they asked the children, why'd you throw the toy with the replica that you made away? They didn't even know what it was. When people die in this culture, they don't perceive it as death. They don't even remember the person because they have no ability. They have no words for like future and past. That person just went off into the woods and they'll be back any day. They have no capacity for future and past thinking. They have crops, but the way that they have crops is because they chew the fruit and spit out the seeds, and it's just naturally growing more seeds. They have, other than that, because the land they live in is so plentiful, everything else they just, hunt and gather. So they don't have any need for future thinking. This is, getting into, of course, Cold Winter's hypothesis as well. So as a result of not needing words, they don't have words, and therefore they don't have concepts. They don't even have concepts of things like death because of total lack of sort of object permanence. And that it seems to bear out Sapir-Whorf because of the limited nature of their language. Now, they've tried to do IQ tests on these people, and they've not found them to be like exceptionally dumber than any other group. And I mean, that's saying a lot, but it's also a very small tribe of people, but they're not, like absolute. I think there's populations in Africa that have lower IQs than these people. So it's not like they're exceptionally dumb. Their language is limiting their capacity for what they can understand.
And this is actually, I think, the most interesting part of Orwell's 1984, right, is the discussion about linguistics and their ability to sort of shape your conception of reality, right? Obviously, 1984 is almost cliched to bring up at this point. But the other thing that reminds me of is there's a very controversial talk given about African languages by, I believe, a South African gentleman.
Yes.
You can probably surmise. Are you familiar with the video?
Yes, I know the exact one you're talking about. Yes.
Yes. And he speaks about one of the other things, which is an inability to express the concept of degree, right? Which is a very basic thing. Like, it's like, well, how the example he uses is there's no way to say, he is halfway up a tree. It is either he is not in it or he is in it, right? It is a binary. There's no degree of gradation, which obviously is a very important concept to have. Zero is another one. One of the ones that you'll see often memed on the internet is the word for, maintenance, which
Maintenance,
does
yes,
not
yeah.
exist in several languages.
In any of them, I don't think. And even when he asked them, the native speakers, because he was not, do you have a word for maintenance? And no, they really functionally do not have a concept of maintaining something that already exists.
Well, and this is actually one of my least favorite pastimes of the kind of Reddit brain is making fun of English as a language. Because they'll say things like, "Oh, like it's completely illogical," and yes, of course it is, right? Every language is irregular to one degree or another. Like this is
Oh,
a
sure.
complete
I've seen
sidebar.
them point to Japanese as a regular, highly ordered language. I speak Japanese. No, it's not. Like, no, I mean, it's got
Try
all kinds of-
reading Greek. Greek
Right?
is like, oh, you've got like, obviously I don't know any modern Greek at all, but the Greek I learned, it was like, okay, here are the rules for 60% of the language. And then the next question is like, well, what's the remaining 40? And it's like, who knows, right? It just works by its own. So obviously that's how language works. But one of the really
There are
interesting
some that are more
features-
structured. Again, like Japanese is more structured, but there are, again, ranges actually here. But yeah, just because it's there are things that are illogical doesn't mean it's not structured.
Of course, right? And the reason I bring up English is because one of the advantages of English is, the old joke goes, it's three languages hiding together in a trench coat. You have kind of like the old English, you have a Germanic influence, then you have French, kind of all blended together. And because of that, English has an incredibly high word count relative to, many other languages, even many other European languages. And one of the advantages to that is that gives you very, very precise words.
Yes.
Right. So the example, and I think this is from Tolkien, who obviously, was a philologist, but, he describes the difference between like a ghost and a spirit. And it's like, okay, technically that's kind of the same thing, but it's getting at something different. And when you have the ability to pull from multiple related concepts, right? It's no shock that English is a language of literature, right? Even many, non-native English speakers recognize that about English as a language. And obviously this isn't just pure cultural chauvinism. It's a little bit of cultural chauvinism, but I do think that that's an interesting example to the contrary, right? Of like, you take a language that has, depending on who you ask, between 12 and 25,000 words, right? And that's an incredible amount of gradation. And a large part of that is, well, okay, a lot of them aren't really English words, right? There's a lot of literal just,
Cognates.
bastardized French in there.
Yeah.
But still, nonetheless, right? It gives you that extremely fine specificity of language.
Oh yeah, and it's definitely unique to English, and it does give it specificity, which is why scientific writing is done in English, I think. I mean, yes, it's also the lingua franca, of course, so it's difficult to delineate these things, and there's historical reasons for it being the lingua franca. But for scientific writing, well, I'll put it this way of how you could tell that is if you go read a scientific paper published in another country in their language, it'll stop and have the English word for it there. Because usually it's a technical term, or even if it's not a technical term, it's just because it's the precise term to describe whatever it is that you're trying to describe. And their language will often have a way of trying to get at that, but it's just easier to use the English word for it, which coming as an amalgam of languages makes sense why it's like that.
Yeah, and this is a slight digression, but I think one of the interesting things about moving, much as we've said, people themselves changed, moving from a spoken to a written to a digitally intermediated language, or that's how they think. You sort of see the same thing with language as well, right? That obviously it was sort of a process to get English from being a spoken to a written language, both literally, in the sense of writing it down, but also in the sense of standardizing it, right? Like the idea of having a dictionary and standardized spelling and standardized grammar, it was sort of a post hoc thing. And
Yeah.
one of the things you see in sort of the world of spoken language is that the internet has flattened accents in a kind of interesting way.
Oh yeah.
So for instance, right, Aydin, you're from Appalachia, right?
Yeah. Well, I grew up in West Virginia before age 11, and then I lived in Baltimore till I was 17, and then I lived in the Midwest, and so I've lived all over. But and when I moved to Baltimore, I was bullied for having a Southern accent, so I worked that out. But so yeah, it sounded like
the
I'm from
reason
nowhere.
the reason I bring it up is I'm also from Appalachia. Not
Yeah.
that you'd know it.
Right.
And some of that's like cultural prejudice, right? Specifically to people who talk like that. But another part of it is I grew up on the internet where everyone talks to everyone. And that is flattened. And you see it even in the UK, right? With the reappearance of the letter H as a spoken sound.
Yeah.
I won't torture you with my awful Cockney accent, but obviously they don't traditionally have not had that sound. And so it is a weird case in which like English has almost become like a separate thing from native English speakers, right? It has become the language of the internet. And you see the kind of birth of these like weird pidgin speaks. You know,
Yeah.
obviously you have like Nigerian pidgin, you know, you have a couple others, but like the sort of genesis of like Spanglish, for example, right? It's just kind of a fascinating thing to watch happen in real time almost.
Oh yeah, it's fascinating to watch patois. I'll tell you, just up here, I'll tell you what, to be completely honest, the pronounced H thing, I have started doing that. Or at least I got to the point where I started noticing myself doing that by listening to myself talk back in my own recordings and stuff that I didn't notice. And I've lived here for 6 years, which was it. Some of that stuff just you acclimate to naturally, I think, or at least over pronouncing it in the way that I didn't before I moved here, obviously. So some of that's just acclimation to, you know, wherever you're living and whatever the way that English is spoken there. I don't think you pick up accents if you move to some place later in life, obviously, generally speaking. But some of the affectations of local differences in English, I think people absolutely do. And that's just to fit in with whatever the local culture is. But that means it's always changing in that sense.
Of course. So one of the other things that I think is interesting about accessing information on the internet, right, is it sort of is Baudrillard's desert of the real, in the sense that, you know, although I think that's actually from The Matrix. I don't think he said that. Never mind. Obviously pulling from his work, but in the sense that, you know, he said, you know, Desert Storm never happened, right? That obviously there was a literal event, but the way in which it was remembered was entirely intermediated by the television, right? It's that footage of, you know, the missile going into the window or whatever. There's sort of a similar way in which culture has completely and totally, I wouldn't even say bifurcated, but just splintered into, you know, thousands of different narratives. And the example that you brought up, right, which for those who want the details, I'll kind of skim over it. This iDubbbz, you know, who you may remember from saying very, very edgy things. Ethan Klein, who you may remember from really liking Israel and Vape Nation, had kind of an online breakup, you know, sort of began kind of, you know, chimping out at one another. But as part of this, you know, other parties got involved. And, you know, one of the big things was calling CPS on Ethan Klein's children. And what's particularly interesting, obviously, that's a scummy thing to do. You shouldn't do it. This is gay internet drama. It's not going to make you smarter. But the interesting thing was the way in which the actual events that happened, right? CPS getting called falsely was sort of retold in multiple completely incompatible ways.
Yeah.
And you know, the internet both having the ability to access information at the tip of your fingers, but also to access narrative, right? To provide a structure for all of those that is almost completely divorced from reality, I think is interesting as well. Do you see what I'm getting at there about the ability to kind of find a narrative to support almost any piece of information from the facts as they lie?
Oh, of course. If you want to run a natural experiment with this, get into an argument with any random R word on Twitter who will immediately, at this point, without fail, go and ask Grok some version of their question wherein the only answer can be, yes, you are correct, to an AI that is already designed to affirm you, no matter what you ask and how wrong it is. So, for example, actually, this is totally random, but speaking of Japanese, I guess it's related, where someone was asking about why they used to translate the word retard in English subtitles from Japanese anime. And I said, well, it probably has something to do with the word aho versus baka. So baka in the main dialect in Tokyo, Ben, means stupid or silly. But baka in Kansai, in dialect spoken in Osaka and Kyoto, baka means more like retard. And then the opposite is the case for the word aho. In Kansai Ben, that means more like silly or stupid. And in Tokyo, that means retarded. Neither one of these words mean clinically mentally disabled. It's just the severity, by the way, again, of that word, the extremity of it. And I was just pointing that out. And somebody went, Grok, does aho mean clinically retarded? No. And, that's the kind of thing, though. And that's them, one, not going and looking this up or being clear about it, but also just they end up in these echo chambers inherently because of who they associate with. And then when they go and ask AI or when they go and Google for whatever it is that they're looking for, they're only looking for confirmatory information. So they'll discard all other sources. And that's very easy to do on the internet, is to find the one source that in any way, in some fashion of twisting, supports what you already believed so that you are never wrong.
Yeah, that's sort of an interesting thing about AI as well. I'm probably overly bearish on AI from any number of perspectives, but
yeah.
Are you familiar with the growth of, I think it's called like My AI Boyfriend, right?
Yeah.
This kind of community of femcells.
Yeah.
Well, look, obviously there's a male version of it as well. I'm not just
Yes.
picking on women, although it is one of my favorite pastimes. But it's
so
sort of
easy.
disturbing. Oh, 100%. They make it so easy. But in all seriousness, right? You see that confirmation process, right? This is a machine that is built to tell you exactly what you want to hear and has an immense amount of data about that. And one of the interesting examples of this is, I believe it was either GPT-3 to GPT-4, that transition. But when that happened, a bunch of people basically felt as if they lost their boyfriend. Like
right.
He was gone. He was changed. And were freaking out. I mean, sending letters, sending threats, like reacting as if they had lost a family member. And obviously, everyone always, would post the memes from Blade Runner, 2049 and, say like, oh, it's like joy. This is so over. And then you see something like that where you're like, oh no, this is thousands of people who have developed a strong emotional attachment to that. It is almost an extension of that same process of moving from, memorization to, having a book, which admittedly you have to physically look for, then to, that kind of hyperlink, right? Where I know how to look for it. Then to, I have a machine in my pocket that tells me exactly what it thinks I want to think. There's sort of a, that's sort of a disturbing, like slide down the slippery slope, I guess.
Well, this goes into the hyperpersonal model of computer-mediated communication, which was first proposed in, I think, like 1995, and I'm forgetting the citation on the author there. But hyperpersonal model, what they hypothesized and has been well evidenced over the last 30 years is that the way that people communicate with each other on the internet is very different from how they do face-to-face, because there's this sense of atemporality. Everything is kind of happening at the same time all at once. And you can get instantaneous responses to things, or it can take a long time for people to respond because they're out doing other things, but the same conversation is still happening. You know what I mean? And that's very different from how we communicate in real life. When you can communicate so much faster with someone online and to so much more extreme degrees than you could sending letters back and forth, right? And so what the hyperpersonal model dictates is that people will fall in love easier and faster and to a more extreme degree because they've got this curated version of the other person that they're talking to a curated version of themselves. This is Irving Goffman's face work as well. And so then when you're talking to an AI that is designed not only to say anything to appease you, but also responds instantaneously to any query, I mean, that's the hyperpersonal model to an extreme degree. Of course, people fall in love with it.
Yeah, well, and that's an interesting. I hadn't considered the temporality of that, right? Because obviously, despite being a Zoomer, I'm still relatively old-fashioned in the sense that I like talking to people on the phone. So, previously I drive a lot for work, and obviously that is a sort of a simulated face-to-face conversation. But it is interesting, right? The sort of the spectrum there of temporality, where on one hand, it's like, well, one, I have to have you pick up the phone, right? You have to have free time to waste with me. Then also, we're sort of simulating a back and forth, right? It is real time. There's no ability to go back and edit. There's no ability to kind of give things, 5 minutes so you can cool down. But
Yeah.
I've noticed this a lot in the workplace, that the difference between a company that works via kind of like older digital technology, right? Phone and email versus something like Slack is night and day because of that temporality, right? Because that is that, instant response immediately right now where everyone can see it, right? It increases the pace, and it increases consequently the expectation as well, right? Things happen much more quickly. That same process, obviously not in a workplace setting of like falling in love, but that like, you can have, an argument falling out, making back up again in 45 minutes, right? All intermediated. And that's actually an interesting, I hadn't really considered that, but you are describing something very real there. And, yeah, obviously the real one shot, right? The thing that just takes out the human race is when we put these AI chatbots in, shall we say, like a physical form. That's the one where I think I just go to my Uncle Ted cabin and am never seen from again.
I mean, I don't know. It doesn't appeal to me, but I'm sure I'm an outlier there. I work with ChatGPT quite a lot on doing stuff. It's terrible at crunching numbers, though, so its use is minimal.
It
for
also
me.
lies.
It lies.
It's kind of disturbing how much it lies if you actually know what you're talking about.
And then when you catch it in a lie, it just goes, oh, my mistake. Whoops. So it's just very frustrating, although fun to best it in it and show it where it lied that it can't get away from. But that's again being parasocial with something that doesn't exist. And this a facsimile of a person. So I don't trust it for much stuff, except for to backtrace my own work. And the other way that I found to make it more useful is that, people fell into this by just talking to it about normal things and then getting more interpersonal, because that's another thing about it too, is that this is maximal anonymity. So there's a ton of research on anonymity that's related to hyperpersonal model, which is de-individuation effects. And de-individuation effects are also that people will tend to overshare and show their deepest, darkest parts of themselves when they feel that they're anonymized. This is sometimes called the strangers on a train or strangers on a plane effect.
I mean, if you've ever been on a message board, you see that.
That's how I got interested in studying calm in the first place, was I wanted to understand why people would go onto 4chan and type the most insane stuff, about their lives. I was like, why are you doing this? So when I was 16 or whatever, I thought that was interesting. Answered that question quickly upon getting to college, but then became interested in the whole field in general. And yeah, that's the same way in the origin of the phrase strangers on a train effect. It's from a novel originally, which is, when you meet someone, I don't know if you've ever done this at a train station, on a train, on a plane, where you are never going to see that person ever again. You might feel a little bit more willing to just talk to them about anything, maybe even something very deeply personal you would never tell anyone in your real life, but you can tell that person because they can't tell anyone else.
Well, I'm using anecdote. I'm a habitual plane talker for exactly that reason, right? Is like, one, you have an interview show, so you're probably good at talking to strangers. But you do just meet fascinating people.
Oh, yeah.
Like I talked to a crime scene investigator who was apparently flying out to go look at a giant meth bust murder scene. And not only given entirely inappropriate amounts of information about this ongoing federal investigation, but like really detailed knowledge of what you're not supposed to do if you kill someone. And, I was obviously it was an amusing story. I did nothing with that information, but in the back of my mind, I was like, you should not be telling me this, right? For any number of reasons, right? Like I just happen to be some random nerd in public who thinks this is fun, but this is very sensitive information that should be given out. Again, just a stupid story to that point. But yeah, I mean, with AI as well, right? It's that same thing where it's like, it is personalized and anonymized. And, with that feedback mechanism as well. Are you familiar with the toaster fucking green text?
No. I mean, I might be, but not on the top of my head.
This is one of my favorite examples. Crudely expressed, but it's basically talking about what the internet did to like paraphilia and subculture. And
Oh,
basically,
yeah. Okay, but remind me because I think I am familiar with this. But yes.
yeah, so it's sort of got two versions of the story, and one of them's dated like 1985. You know, the first line is, you know, you look at a toaster, you say that toaster looks kind of good. You go into class the next day and say, I want to have sex with a toaster. You get mercilessly mocked and never think about it again. Versus, you know, 2020 or whenever it
Yeah.
was done, right? You go online and you have access to, you know, a full community of people where that is their identity. It's like,
Yeah,
oh yeah, we're all into toasters.
toasterfuckers.net. That yeah,
Exactly.
we're
And you
all
get-
brothers here.
You get pulled down a rabbit hole. Now imagine that with, you know, an AI chatbot, right? Something that
Mhm.
is constantly morphing to, you know, affirm you in every way, right? To tell you, you know, whatever you're doing is the best idea ever, provide you more resources, right? It's sort of supercharging that mechanism. And when you combine that with the increased anonymity of, you know, saying whatever, you know, your deepest, darkest desires are, right? It's like you don't even have the minor level of, you know, social stigma associated with, you know, an online handle, right? Obviously, you know, there's been an explosion of bizarre subcultures. Obviously, the furries, who are sort of like the internet mafia, right? Like, yeah, you have to be kind of
Yeah.
nice to them, at least obliquely, or you might disappear. But point is, right? Like that's kind of the classic example of like, oh, this is something so weird that could only happen on the internet. But it's like, oh, well, guess what? That is going to accelerate, right? At least based off of available data.
I mean, to be clear, though, you're not talking anonymously to these things. There was recently evidence that showed that people's private conversations with AI chatbots were showing up on Google searches because it's all intermingled with each other. So, I mean, all that LLMs are Google scrapers. They're just looking up things online and repeating an amalgamation of what they find. It's why, you know, I use ChatGPT quite a lot for basic searches and things like that. And particularly when just today I was using it because I was looking for the relationship between marriage and being a father and criminality. But because of the words that are involved in it, all I was finding for dozens of pages of going through research was fatherlessness, not having a father, and what that did to criminality. But no, I wanted to find it the other way around. And after searching for like 5 minutes, I said, I'll just ask ChatGPT, and found it instantly. But I've told my version of ChatGPT to not do that little cute stuff. Don't tell me, oh, that's an interesting thing you've pointed out or something like that. No, and it still does it. Sometimes it'll drop it for a little bit, but I can see how incredibly affirming that probably is to people just using it for everyday purposes. For me, I want it to act like a machine because I'm using it like a tool as it should be used. But it's ingrained in their, you know, coding to try and approximate a human.
Well, and you sort of have to break the system a little bit to get any interesting data.
Oh yeah.
So in a weird way, this is why enjoying video games as a child was actually pretty helpful, because you learn how to exploit very simple AI.
Yeah, yeah.
But for instance, I don't have health insurance, and obviously you don't need medical care every once in a while. And AI will never tell you how to cure yourself using stuff you have in your house.
Oh, I'm
But
sure.
if you tell it in a hypothetical survival situation, with
Right.
whatever I have, what would be a good solution? It'll tell you immediately, right? In
Right.
Minecraft. And it is kind of funny. And obviously, you know, this is a relatively new technology. I assume that will be removed and it will be turned into a, you know, a stupider version of itself. But it is kind of funny to see. And that really has been kind of the story of the last, you know, year or so, right? Has been the kind of like war between the internet and AI. Obviously, Tay is the most infamous example.
Right.
But, you know, Grok becoming Mecha Hitler and going on a rampage.
Grok
threatening
between
to-
Mecha Hitler was certainly an interesting couple of days on Twitter, that's for sure.
And I love Will Sansel's one of my favorite people to follow on the internet. I find him incredibly entertaining. Never interact. I'm just Jane Goodall,
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Watching.
yeah. Yes.
But watching that man,
Oh, I know. That was absolutely hilarious. He was petrified that Grok was going to come for him.
and this is obviously very, very R-rated, not to be discussed on a family friendly production such as this. But this how specific the threats were
Yes.
was the thing that made it so funny. Like, obviously it's a machine, but it was hilarious, and you just know that this like neurotic, soy boy from Minnesota was just losing his mind.
Yeah, the computers were after him. I mean, it was full Skynet. Like,
Instead of Sarah Connor, it's Will Stansel running from a roided up robot with a never mind.
Device, yeah.
Yeah.
Wielding a device, yes, against him.
Well, Aydin, this was a completely just scattered conversation. I had a ton of fun speaking to you. But if people want to find more of you and your work, where can they do so?
Yeah, it's Aydin Paladin on YouTube, Aydin Paladin. I just released 2 videos in a row that were a little bit different from my normal content, and they've not done as well, I think, as a result. But I think they're really interesting. I did 2 documentaries on 2 different doctors who published a bunch of research during the COVID pandemic. The first one, in my opinion, is is not the best video I've ever made. It's 3.5 hours long. It's a biography of this doctor named Didier Raoult, out of France, who was, he was one of the guys that the Trump team was on board with his research, saying chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine is the cure for, I know more often people were talking about ivermectin, but chloroquine was also one that was circulated as this wonder drug that would fix it. He unethically experimented on, I mean, at an absolute minimal level, over 30,000 French people without proper ethical control.
French people.
Well, that's the baseline. That's not going into the research he conducted without ethical approvals in Africa. So he did it over 30 years. He conducted. I mean, I wouldn't even want to hazard a guess as to how many people were potentially negatively affected by his research that didn't have ethical approval, which is important because for medical research you have to run it by someone first to make sure you can do that, and that there's not going to be anyone who's being unnecessarily harmed by it. That was 3.5 hours because of the extensiveness of the nonsense he got up to in the University of Aix-Marseille. And then I just put out one just this last week, not even a week ago, actually, which was about a doctor in Malta who was also published a lot of stuff about how, everyone has to get jabbed. Little children need to get jabbed. They need to get jabbed from infancy kind of stuff. That sort of guy. He's a pediatrician telling everyone in Malta to do this. His research, on the other hand, was him publishing articles repurposed from his Star Trek blog in a pediatric medicine journal. It's just about Star Trek. That's it. And he published 17 articles in a serious journal.
Huh. Well.
And that was the period of COVID exception, to use the Schmittian term.
I've not seen that video. I was waiting for you to land that story. You could have given me 100 guesses. That would not have been the conclusion of that sentence. Yeah, I mean, honestly, and this is largely off topic, but it is kind of a fascinating thing, right? The realizing that the corruption of like scientific journals is not. Obviously, you hear big headline stories. And the temptation is to say, well, that was a bad apple. That was a 1 in a million. Yeah. And obviously it is still relatively rare. But to your point, right, you start digging into it and you realize like, oh, wait, this overproduction of PhDs has created a massive industry for making complete and total fake science, right? Absolute nonsense.
Yeah, you have to publish lest you perish. That is the system under which academics operate. If you don't publish research, you won't get tenure. You're not going to get a raise. You're not going to get more funding for your lab. So you have to publish something. And the reality is that for a lot of people, they have no interest in publishing. So they're forced to do something they have no interest in. So what do they do instead? They published research on their Star Trek fan wiki page. Here's my description of 2 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I mean, this is actually what his articles are like. So,
I mean, even in undergraduate, you see that, right? I wrote a lot of really stupid papers.
But again, I expect it in undergrad. I don't expect it to be published in a journal about fetal and perinatal development. But I will give that guy one thing. It's through him that I found the sex ratio at birth stuff.
All right, fair enough.
Because he published a paper on whether or not the sex ratio at birth was skewed by the death of Elvis. if the death of Elvis was such a tragedy that it caused women to have fewer sons 9 months later, the answer was no. But, but I was I was flabbergasted. I was like, why would you ask such a question? And I figured, well, I have to go read his rationale, and he brings up Trivers Willard, and then I went and read Trivers Willard hypothesis, and then found all the sex ratio at birth stuff. And that's how I came to this conclusion about the actual sex ratios at birth for the native English population being the same as the Congo. So very long way to get to that end, but yeah, from Star Trek.
Honestly, if that is the bare minimum requirement for topics to write a scientific journal, I've got some great questions we could dig into. We can figure out the science later, but.
Well, there was no science. It was just, I'm going to describe Captain Catherine Janeway, or it was mostly medical doctor. I'm going to describe, here's a whole paper about who is Leonard McCoy from the original series of Star Trek. Oh, here's his catchphrases. Journal for Fetal and Perinatal Medicine.
Well, this is one of those things, and even in outside of the scientific setting, I volunteer at a school as a thesis reader, right, a second reader. And most of these kids are 18, 19, so you're not expecting perfection, but that is sort of an interesting thing as well, where you realize very quickly if someone actually has something to say, because in a normal paper, obviously there will be background, and that might take up 30-40% of it, because certain things have to be established. You have to show your work, so to speak. But once you realize, you're like, wait a minute, this is 90% you summarizing something else. It is very clear you had no ideas at all. And that's one thing if it's like an academic book, where at least it's like, all right, you had to read something. But when your version of that sort of lazy scholarship is just summarizing 2 episodes of a science fiction television show from the 90s, right?
Yeah. It's not exactly what I'd call research. By the way, those Star Trek papers, unretracted.
Oh, they're still out?
Oh, they're still up. 2 of his COVID papers were withdrawn from that journal because he overestimated I don't have it off the top of my head, but the more or less ratio, but he was off by a factor of 40 in his predicted infant or child mortality rates. So he was telling the people of Malta that there was a 6% chance of death for a child who catches COVID. It was really 0.000000087, I believe. And he said it was 6. So that had to be retracted. But the Star Trek ones are still sitting pretty.
And I guess the argument is like, he said he was going to summarize it. He did. Yep. He accomplished his goal.
He did what he set out to accomplish, it indeed. But it shouldn't be published anyway. But I have to thank him, though, thanks for that Elvis paper. I found something neat through that. So you never know where you're going to find interesting bits of information, even in seemingly the most useless research. But that was, I think, just by happenstance.
Yeah, exactly. Right. A stopped clock and all that. Well, as far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show available, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to politics. Again, Aydin, thank you so much. This was a ton of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Cheers, Ben.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.